Jemima to reply back via the instant message or text. Great. Okay. It seems like everyone's on board. I'd like to give a big thank you to Motorship for inviting me and the Coast Guard to present this morning. Also, I'd like to thank Jemima for coordinating all the logistics behind this particular webinar or webcasting. It certainly was a challenge, to say the least, not only in getting me logged in, but to tell me that my presentation was going to be at 9:30 your time, which is 2:30 in the morning my time. But nonetheless, I'm very excited to be here and speak a little bit about eco-driving the U.S. as a marine fuel market. And I'll go ahead to the first slide. I'd like to divide this presentation up into 5 different sections. We'll talk a little bit about U.S. Coast Guard's involvement in the LNG as fuel space, as well as why LNG. I think many of the presentations before and after me will probably speak to many of those same issues. Nonetheless, I will speak to those specifically on the environmental issue. And then I'll follow into the state of the U.S. industry, and as time permitting, watching the clock, we'll see if we can talk a little bit about a regulatory overview from a Coast Guard standpoint, from a U.S. standpoint. And then I do want to conclude with just a few announcements that I'd like to make in closing. So before we get started, I'll talk about the Coast Guard's involvement, and I'm sure many in the room are already familiar with the Coast Guard's role within the maritime space here in the United States. We do have 11 different missions. Those missions vary from drug interdiction to aid to navigation and defense readiness. But 3 of those missions are near and dear to my heart, and that's our prevention missions that are made up by coastal security, maritime safety, and also marine environmental protection. These are what allow the Coast Guard to regulate vessels, facilities, and waterways from a regulatory standpoint. Specifically to the LNG space, or the LNG as fuel area within the maritime community, there are a few offices that are integral to that aspect of our oversight. I'll start on the bottom of the screen, the bottom left, explaining the sector's role. The sector is the field office, and sometimes sectors have a subordinate command called the Marine Safety Unit. Those 2 units are the units that actually have the authority and the jurisdiction and the responsibility to regulate the industry, both vessels and sometimes facilities in the waterways themselves. They report to districts above them. Above them are areas. There's 2 areas, one on the East Coast and one on the West Coast. And they report to headquarters. And headquarters is made up of many different offices. The org chart in the middle, the bubbles in the middle of the CG, ENG, and those below it represent a few of the offices, one of over 200 at Coast Guard headquarters, but those are just a few, 5 or 6 that actually work in the LNG fuel space. CG, ENG is responsible for vessel design standards. OES is responsible for operational standards. CVC is for compliance after the vessel's been built and now operational, and how the Coast Guard interacts with that vessel from an inspection standpoint. CG-FAC is the office that's responsible for facilities, facility standards. And then the CG-5PTI are traveling inspectors. Those are inspectors at Coast Guard headquarters that can help the field conduct their mission when they don't have technical expertise at the local office. So they work under the sector or the Marine Safety Office authority to conduct the mission for them when they don't have that expertise. And that's where the National Centers of Expertise fall under, the traveling inspectors, and we play a very similar role to them. And then finally, in that same column is the Marine Safety Center, the MSC. That's the office that's responsible for doing all of our plan review, primarily for vessels, but in some cases facilities as well. So I'll focus a little bit more on what my office is responsible for, and that is the National Center of Expertise for Liquefied Gas. There's a relatively small office, and we focus in 4 different areas. We focus in LNG as fuel, LNG bunkering, LNG facilities, and LNG carriers. LNG carriers is really our bread and butter, what we do most, but LNG fuel is becoming certainly an emerging industry, and one that the Coast Guard is asking us to take some leadership in. So some of the missions for the National Centers of Expertise, specifically the one that I work at, the Liquefied Gas National Center of Expertise, is we're a force multiplier for inspections and investigations throughout the Coast Guard. So as those local units need technical support on liquefied gas issues, they'll call us in, whether on the phone or on site, to provide that expertise. We also bolster the inspection and technical capacity. We track workforce. We also train the future workforce of the Coast Guard from a liquefied gas perspective. We provide training for all the future liquefied gas inspectors in the Coast Guard. In addition to that, we provide consultation and technical advice to the maritime industry. So we can summarize some of those things I just said by saying that we provide technical advice to the Coast Guard field offices on the liquefied gas industry, as well as provide some expertise on the Coast Guard for the maritime industry as well in relation to the liquefied gas industry. And then we reinvigorate industry partnerships, which is one of the reasons why I'm here with you today. Some of the services that we offer are listed there. We have many services, and we mentioned some of them before. But one of them I'd like to highlight, and I'd like to say that I'd like to thank some of the partners that we have, the industry partners that we have been working with recently, not to mention Wärtsilä and DNVGL and CHART, Westpac, ABS, and Trelleborg, all of them who have or are currently working on providing a bi-monthly webinar for us. So I know many of them are represented in the conference today, and we certainly thank them for their support. So moving into why LNG is fuel, I think you'll hear these reasons many times today, and I'm going to let those experts in the room speak to the first two, certainly. I'll have just one slide for them, but it really can be summarized into three different reasons. The supply is there. We do have LNG or liquefied gases that can provide a very viable maritime fuel. The cost is cost beneficial, and then also the environment. I'll focus on the environment before I move on to the next subject. So from a supplier perspective, within the U.S. alone, just a few facts to throw at you. The U.S. is the fifth largest natural gas reserves, 5%, and that's current trends that could change, go up or down as we find more finds throughout the world. In addition, we are the world's largest producer of natural gas. Now, none of this is currently, or very little of this is actually liquefied, but we are producing close to 20% of the natural gas around the world. All of that stays, for the most part, in the U.S. as of now. And we are the 17th country out of 17 countries that export liquefied natural gas, and that will certainly change if you look at that chart down below. In the coming years, in 2024, we're expected to double, if not triple, Qatar's current capacity. Now, that's the most optimistic outlook, and certainly some economists could question some of those statistics, but right now we're looking to certainly increase much of our export of liquefied natural gas. From a cost perspective, you can see, and I'm sure many in the room and economists will tell you that there's always a spread between natural gas and diesel and natural gas and HFO. You see that spread historically on the chart to the left, and you see that predicted by EIA on the right-hand side moving forward in 2030. Now, certainly the drop in the oil market in 2015 has affected some of those, but the spread generally is always there. And again, I'll let subsequent speakers speak to these points more specifically. But what I can talk about in more detail is the environmental benefits of LNG as a fuel. And I've heard some of the presenters before me already allude to it. Certainly from a SOx perspective or sulfur oxide perspective, we're looking at 100% reduction in particulate matter, also 100% nitrogen oxide, 90%, and 25%, upwards of 25% carbon dioxide. These types of pollutants actually create lots of respiratory issues, asthma, heart and lung disease, acid rain, haze, or smog within a particular port, bronchitis, greenhouse gases that lead to climate change, all bad stuff that we want to prevent. And there are regulations that are helping the industry clean up so that we don't pollute the environment in the future. And I'll move on to some of those requirements, and certainly the biggest one is the North American and the Caribbean ECA, the emissions control area, adopted in 2010 and 2011, respectively. And what it does is it's currently since 2015, early 2015, has dropped the SOx limits down to 0.1% sulfur. So the solution for operators now is HFO and scrubbers, distillate fuels, or LNG or other liquefied gases that have low sulfur content. This is just another chart showing that not only is it affected in the eco zones with 1%, but we're looking at a 3.5% limitation for a global fleet, which is expected to be lowered to 0.5% in 2020, although that is subject to a study that should be completed in 2018 by the IMO. Here in the U.S., some of the enforcement is shared by both the Coast Guard and EPA. The Coast Guard leads the vessel inspections. We also take a look at fuel changeover and changeover procedures, bunker delivery notes and fuel samples, logbook entries, and we also refer most violations to EPA, and I'll talk about some of the enforcement actions that both we and the EPA have. But before I do that, I'll talk a little bit about what the EPA does. The EPA conducts the shoreside fuel compliance, as well as provide Coast Guard with expertise in fuel sampling, and also manages the fuel non-availability reports, which is the reports that are required when a vessel comes into the port and doesn't meet the low sulfur or the ultra low sulfur fuel content. In addition, EPA also has the ability, along with the Coast Guard, to provide civil penalty enforcement and refer a case for administrative and criminal investigations. The documentation, the ways that we can enforce compliance is violations as a deficiency. We can also revoke customs clearances. We can require a letter of undertaking or a bond to keep the vessel in port, and also issue a notice of violation, which is a kind of like a fine for a vessel that doesn't comply. And then going further down on the level of enforcement, issue a civil penalty, which are usually more severe, and then refer the case to EPA, and then subsequently the Department of Justice as well. I always get asked at this point is, these are all tools that are in our tool belt. Which ones have we, the Coast Guard, and EPA utilized so far? We've utilized almost all the tools, although the ones towards the end do take a long time, and in those cases they're all in process, so I don't have any statistics to show you what types of penalties and what types of violations have been issued and paid by vessels that have violated this regulation. So from the state of the industry perspective, let's talk about what the U.S. is seeing right now. We have a number of LNG fuel vessels that are either in operation right now, I can certainly happily say, and or close to being put into service. Tote has 4 vessels. I'm sure many of them, and many of you in the room are aware of these. They have 2 Orca-class conversions that are looking to be converting in for operation up in the Northwest out of Seattle on a Seattle-Alaska run. In addition to that, the Marlin-class vessels, which one of them has recently been completed and put in service, had its first cargo just last week, went through the Panama Canal and is on its way and currently in Jacksonville. That will be operating out of Jacksonville on a Jacksonville, Puerto Rico route. And then the Crawley has 2 vessels, also container vessels, but these are actually container ro-ro vessels, Conroe vessels, being built out of Pascagoula. And then Harvey Gulf has 6 vessels being built. Of them, 2 are already operational and operating on a Shell contract down in Gulfport, Louisiana. To support these vessels, certainly we need LNG bunkering facilities, and we have a number of them that are either looking for permits and or already have some kind of permit to allow the transfer of LNG in their port. Puget Sound, starting on the northwest, moving circular down south over to the Gulf Coast and then back up on the East Coast. Puget Sound Energy is looking to have a facility out of Tacoma. NASCO facility has a bunkering operation and has completed at least one operation on the first tote vessel that was completed in the NASCO shipyard. Martin Energy down in Pascagoula to fuel the first LNG OSVs that came out of Pascagoula in Westport. And then there's also the Harvey Gulf facility out of Port Fourchon that's currently being loaded by tank trucks, and will be also be loaded by tank trucks to a shore-based facility, and then subsequently by barge. And then Pivotal LNG in Jacksonville, as well as Westpac Midstream bunker barge out of Jacksonville as well. So let's talk a little bit about a regulatory framework and how the Coast Guard has provided some regulations and or policy and guidance for the LNG as fuel and LNG bunkering space. But before I do that, I'd like to just point out that our regulations and codes and policy and guidance is either driven by an incident, in most cases, from top down, where Congress actually enacts a law and creates a code, and then the relevant regulatory body, in most cases for the maritime space would be the Coast Guard, would create regulations, and those regulations could be further refined into policy, or sometimes we call those NAVICs, and National Vessel Navigation Vessel Information Circulars, and then sometimes on a case-by-case basis, they're also further interpreted and allow equivalencies. Going the other direction, if it's project-driven, and we see this a lot in the LNG space, it starts out as an equivalency, or we'll call that a design basis, a one-off for that particular operation that they're allowing, or the vessel that they're conducting a design basis for. And then over time, as the Coast Guard sees this being a trend, it will create a Coast Guard policy and then potentially regulation. So we'll see that in the next couple slides as I move forward. The next couple slides, I'm going to be really quick. All this information is available on our website, as well as in this slide. These slides and this slide deck will be available to all those in the attendance today. But I'll cover LNG fuel vessels. In this actual chart on the graph on the right-hand side, it was taken from an ABS guidance document showing the LNG fuel vessel in red, but all the different types of bunkering operations associated with it, which is a good representation of how the Coast Guard has divided some of its policy letters to reflect these different operations. From an LNG bunker barge, so a ship-to-ship transfer from a barge to a ship, an LNG bunker facility from a shore-based facility or a tank truck to a ship, and then a cargo facility from an ISO container being loaded onto a ship where there's no over-the-water transfer of LNG. So I'm going to go ahead and just highlight a few of the key policy letters. I highlighted them in yellow and in red. I'm not going to talk about anything else on this slide in order to save us some time. From an LNG fuel vessel perspective, from design only, the CG 521 policy letter 0112 is an equivalency determination for design criteria of LNG fuel vessel, LNG fueled systems. This is looking to be updated to reflect the new interim guidelines for gas-fueled ships that came out of the IMO in effect in 2017. We will update this policy letter to reflect that. In addition, from an operational perspective, still sticking with LNG fueled vessels, there are two policy letters to keep in mind, and that's the CG OES policy letter 0115 and also the MSRO policy letter, which is a secured document, but I can share with you one key aspect of that that's important to note, and this is policy letter 0713. That one you will not find available anywhere online because it is a secured document, but a key part of that to know is that the Coast Guard has determined that LNG fueled vessels and bunkering operations do not require an escort, unlike our deep draft LNG cargo vessels. From a barge standpoint, we also have a relatively new design policy letter, ENG policy letter 0215, and then also very similar to the operational standpoint requirements or policy letters for LNG fueled vessels. I'm going to go to the next slide. Operationally, barges are regulated under the OES policy letter 0215 and the MSRO policy letter 0713, which I referenced under LNG fueled vessels, very similar. LNG bunkering facilities, from an operational standpoint, the OES policy letter, that should be highlighted in red because that's the first time I brought that to your attention. 0215 regulates or gives the guidance for operational aspects of LNG bunkering facilities. And then No change here. This is a relatively old requirement, and it's in the CFRs, is the requirement for handling of dangerous cargo, which LNG on an ISO container would be treated as such, and that facility would be regulated under 33 CFR 126. I'm going to skip all of this, but I just bring to your attention that there are many risk analyses that are required within the IGF code as well as within our policy letters that we have. So this kind of breaks down from a LNG fueling facilities perspective, LNG barge perspective, and LNG fueled vessel perspective, both from the design standpoint and operational standpoint, and when risk analyses are required and what types of risk analysis is required as well. I have just 3 announcements to make to you today. I'd like to just bring to your attention a recent NCOE field notice that we put out in 0115. It's field notice 0115. We just put it out 2 months ago. It's LNG bunkering recommendations, and it brings to light the importance of having procedures and for the crew on board to be very familiar with the LNG bunkering operation, also to respect rest periods and have some kind of alarm for recording some kind of record of alarms, and making sure our approved plans, even when a vessel is in a construction state, the approved plans for the actual LNG fuel transfer are completed before the LNG transfer is initiated. I'd like to also announce that we have just put out invitations for a LNG liquefied gas senior executive forum. This is going to be a 2-day event that we're holding in Houston, Texas on December 9th and December 10th. Senior executives from within the Coast Guard and other government agencies, captain of the ports from around the country, as well as chiefs of prevention at district offices, all captains and above, will be there to learn about the industry. A lot of this is novel and new to them, and allow them. Our goal is to allow them to become more familiar with the industry. All different aspects of the industry, from large-scale liquefaction facilities to large-scale LNG carriers, floating LNG. But of particular note for those in the room today is Session 4 and 5, which is specific to LNG fueled vessels and LNG bunkering operations. Those 2 panels are going to be sponsored by SGMF and moderated by Mr. Mark Bell of SGMF. The second day, we're going to take a field trip of sorts, a field visit out to Conrad Shipyard, where they're building the first LNG-fueled bunker barge, one of a few that's proposed for the U.S., but that one is already under construction, and there will be a membrane tank, and GTT will also be involved to explain the tank construction down at Conrad Shipyard. In addition, we'll be making a visit over to Cameron LNG liquefaction facility and the NCOE as well for some presentations on the 10th. If you'd like to be invited to this event, please send me an email, and my last slide will have my email address that you could request attendance for this event. And I would also like to announce that just last month we put out a Proceedings magazine. This comes out four times a year by the Coast Guard, and it doesn't always focus on the prevention mission, or at least specifically the oil and gas industry. This issue does. It's on America's Energy Renaissance. It's a 92-page publication with 26 articles in there, and contributors from 36 authors from around the industry and within the Coast Guard as well. This is available for free online, and you can also ask for a hard copy subscription by going to that website. That's right there, uscg.mil/proceedings. There's lots of articles in this edition that relate to the types of topics that you'll be discussing today, the future for LNG fuel shipping, and the types of fuel projects and design and operating standards. Many of them that are referenced today are also reiterated in this magazine. And I'd like to also just highlight some of the industry partners that have helped us put some of these articles together: ABS and SGMF, Black & Veatch, and GTT as well. So that concludes my presentation. I'd like to put my contact information up there. My email address and phone number is there if you'd like to follow up with any questions. I think we're going to open it up to any questions on the text blocks, but I'd like to just conclude by saying that the Coast Guard is prepared for LNG as fueled operations. in that the Liquefied Gas National Center of Expertise is available to support LNG projects. We look forward to hearing from you. And if you're available to attend, we'd love to have you down in Houston for the Senior Executive Forum on 9th and 10th. So that completes my presentation. Any questions on the other end of the webcam?
So we don't normally take questions during the keynote address.
Great, thank you, and good luck. I hope you all have a successful seminar out in Durban.
Thank you very much for your very complete presentation.